Now we're going to talk about the build-up to the 1964 presidential election. Now, so far as the primary season was concerned for Democrats, they had a sitting Democratic president who was running for re-election, Lyndon Johnson, who had was in the process of finishing out the final year of Kennedy's term. So, it's not like there's a huge contest there, though there was a contest among the Republicans. In the summer, nonetheless, there was a voter registration drive for the Democratic Party in Mississippi that was organized by SNCC. I shouldn't say for the Democratic Party, for the presidential election. Organized by SNCC, trying to get African Americans in Mississippi registered, which was met with much resistance by many of the white citizens of Mississippi. Now remember, the Democrats were very strong in the South, and so was racism. 3 of the volunteer workers who were registering voters were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi. One of them was a local African American young man, and the other 2 were young white men who had come to participate and to help in this drive. Now, it tends, sadly, to get national attention more when white people are murdered by white racists than when African Americans are, at least in the past, and I would argue that that's still true. It's not how it should be, but it is often how it is, because that's what it takes sometimes to get the attention of some white people. So these 3 young men were murdered. At the same time, Fannie Lou Hamer, that's her pictured there, she was a worker there in Mississippi, and she had been part of this voter registration drive. She testified to the effect of the harassment and assaults that the workers in the drive had experienced, and she was part of the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who sent delegates to the National Democratic Convention to be seated for Mississippi. They were essentially breaking off from the main Democratic Party in Mississippi, which was a segregationist party there in Mississippi. Remember what President Johnson said about the results of the Civil Rights Act. Anyway, she and the other 4 delegates came to the Democratic National Convention to be seated as delegates, but they weren't allowed to be seated because their sort of splinter group was not recognized. And she gave a powerful speech. She refused to compromise. She was offered 2 of the 4 seats, and she said, "We're all tired, and we have come here, and we expect to be seated. We've worked hard for it." And she wasn't seated then, though they were seated the next time in 1968. But she gave a very compelling and powerful speech, and garnered a lot of recognition for her efforts and her abilities and for her cause. Now let's talk a little bit about what was going on in the other party, and there was quite a bit going on. Now, we've already talked about the New Conservatives when we were discussing the 1950s, which is when they sort of arose, but they were really coming into their own by the mid-1960s. So just to summarize, to remind you, the New Conservatives believed that the old Conservatives weren't conservative enough. That's kind of the basic approach. And they also believed that conservatism not only applied to finances, but to social conservatism as well, right? They were really hyper emphasizing the war on communism. I mean, everybody was emphasizing the war on communism except the communists, but they really were full bore all the way to the hilt on that. They believed that Eisenhower Republicans far too moderate. Basically, that they were sellouts to FDR. They emphasized morals and absolute truths and religion and family and tradition and those things. And what we haven't talked about is the fact that they also opposed civil rights. They opposed civil rights because it was a disruption of tradition. It was a disruption in their eyes of society. And one of the foremost voices for the new conservatives at this time, and actually for a long time, for decades, was this guy, William F. Buckley Jr., who was, well, he was kind of, on the surface, he seemed like the stereotypical old guard Republican. He came from a very wealthy family. He had a very upper crust accent. But in the early 1950s, when he came to prominence, he had done so by defending McCarthy and McCarthyism. He founded a magazine in 1955 called the National Review that is still one of the foremost conservative publications in the United States. Now, this is kind of the irony. At that time, the new conservatives were complaining about the old conservatives not being conservative. Now the magazine of the new conservatives, because it has become old, is considered not conservative enough by a lot of modern conservatives. Anyway, that's all very confusing. This guy was one of the most prominent public intellectuals, not just of conservatism, but just in general, of public discourse of the late 20th century, all the way to the very beginning, I think, of the 21st century when he passed away. Well, the National Review was very outspoken from the time it was established in 1955 for about a decade thereafter, very outspoken against Martin Luther King and against the civil rights movement. They said some very nasty things, in fact. However, by the mid-1960s, they were starting to change gears on that, and Buckley, in fact, had become an admirer of Dr. King. So to his credit, he walked back a lot of the stuff that his magazine had been saying about civil rights. Then there was the John Birch Society, who took a lot of the things that the new conservatives said and ran with them, in a manner of speaking, ran right through the wall with them to some extremes. The organization was founded in 1958 by several wealthy investors, including Robert Welch and a guy named Fred Koch, who has some sons that are known today as the Koch brothers, if you've ever heard of them. This is their dad. By 1960, they had about 100,000 members. They were radical conservatives. They were radically opposed, not just to communism, but to communist plots. They were sort of like keeping McCarthyism alive. They were heavily promoting American involvement in Vietnam. They called President Eisenhower, former President Eisenhower, a traitor because of his moderate views. He was practically a communist. And one of the most interesting things was the conspiracy theory they had that the government fluoridation of water was actually an insidious government plot to weaken America and maybe even to control your mind. They were way out there. William F. Buckley sort of led the way among conservatives in opposing this group because he thought they were just a little too far out there. Then you've got this individual, Ayn Rand, who was a Russian immigrant, which did not rouse the ire of McCarthyites because she was from an old guard, wealthy Russian family. The the group known as White Russians, as opposed to Red Russians, who were just absolutely opposed to communism. And they're the people the communists overthrew, essentially, so fled the country. She was a novelist. She wrote, well, her most famous works were Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. And she propounded her philosophy that she called objectivism, that she defined, quote, as, quote, the concept of man as a heroic being with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. In essence, she was saying that the traditional view of morality, which includes, you know, things like helping the underprivileged and doing good for others, was actually immoral. That the only moral purpose was in pursuing your own benefit and your own happiness. And if you do anything other than that, you're a hypocrite. And that being productive and achieving things for yourself, not to share with other people, but for yourself, was the highest purpose in life. Now, she had a lot of influence. She was very libertarian, essentially, but she had a lot of influence on many conservatives and on some people who today call themselves conservatives. However, William F. Buckley was also adamantly opposed to her because this whole thing of reason being your only absolute. She was an atheist, you see. And new conservatives were extremely religious and promulgated traditional Christianity. So these two did not mix. Barry Goldwater had run for the Republican nomination in 1960 and had lost out to Richard Nixon. Well, in 1964, he got it. So he's the Republican nominee, the candidate who will be running against Lyndon Johnson. Goldwater was a hero to the New Conservatives. He had, he lined up in most ways with the New Conservatives, although he also had a bit of a libertarian streak as well. He called for the repeal of Social Security, which was, criticized back in the 1930s by conservatives as virtually being communism, and for an end of what he called the welfare state. He also would heavily criticize Lyndon Johnson's idea of this new thing called Medicare, and essentially claimed that that was going to lead to just wholesale communism in America. He also called for a much more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union, to the point that nuclear war, if necessary, a limited, winnable nuclear war, was something that was worth considering. Some people call that fanaticism, and he said fanaticism in defense of your country is patriotism. He also called for the abolition of the graduated income tax. Remember, the flat tax was one of the ideas favored here. And he opposed the Civil Rights Act. Not outwardly because of racism, because of being pro-segregation, but because he claimed that it violated states' rights, and it also violated the rights of the individual business owner to decide who they would or would not serve. So Goldwater was, he had quite a following, like I said, among the young New Conservatives, and he's going to have a huge, huge impact on the Republican Party, just not yet. I said earlier when talking about the 64 election that the Democratic candidate was pretty well foreordained, the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson, as though that was something that could be counted on, and really it could be. But he did have some early competition in the primary from George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, who had actually announced that he was going to be running in the primary before Kennedy was assassinated. So he started off running against Kennedy. He was, when I say he was pro-segregation, I mean he was really, really pro-segregation, to the extent that on June the 11th, 1963, when the University of Alabama was supposed to be integrated, Wallace, the governor at the time, literally stood in the doorway to prevent black students from coming in, which was something that led to a tense showdown and that caused President Kennedy to actually call the National Guard to come in and essentially force the governor to get out of the way, at which point, to avoid that type of conflict, he did. This incident was recreated in Forrest Gump. There in the upper right-hand corner, you might remember that scene. Think for a moment about that date, June the 11th, 1963. That was the day that Kennedy gave his civil rights speech. So in the afternoon, he was essentially ordering the National Guard to go and forcibly, physically remove the governor of Alabama so the school could be integrated, and giving that speech just a few hours later that evening. Well, Wallace did not come close to really knocking Johnson off in 3 early primaries, I think Wisconsin, Indiana, and Maryland. He came in, a distant second, but he did manage to get about 1/3 of the votes in the primary in those states, which, Indiana and Wisconsin, Midwestern states, far to the north of the former Confederacy, Maryland, a former slave state, but not a Confederate state. And that kind of gave Johnson and his supporters some pause. And that might have contributed to his prediction later on with the passage of the Civil Rights Act that the Democrats were going to be handing the South over to the Republicans, because the Kennedy-Johnson ticket was already showing some signs of unpopularity, to the extent that a rabid segregationist racist was getting votes in northern states. So if that's going to happen in northern states, what will it be like in the South? So it did wind up being Johnson and Goldwater. That presidential campaign saw the release of probably the most famous political ad of all time. It started off with this cute little girl with a daisy, and so it's referred to as the Daisy Girl ad. And she's plucking off the petals of the daisy and counting them, and getting the numbers wrong because she's a cute little girl. And her counting turns into the voice of a man counting down to a rocket launch, followed by nuclear annihilation. And then this message.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So the message that the voice of President Johnson is conveying to America is, Barry Goldwater's out of his ever-loving mind. He's going to blow up your children if he gets a chance. For God's sake, get out and vote for Lyndon Johnson. And apparently it worked. Now this is kind of vaguely similar to the 1948 election with Truman and Dewey, except not nearly as extreme. The fact is that leading up to the election, polls had Goldwater pulling close to Johnson. But on the actual day of the election, Goldwater won 6 states, Johnson won 44, plus the District of Columbia, and he had 61.5% of the popular vote compared to 38.5%. So Goldwater got shellacked, essentially. He only managed to win his home state of Arizona and pretty much the entire Deep South. Notice that. The Deep South, the solid South, all of the election maps we've looked at over this course, I keep pointing out, look at the South, and the Democrat always has won in the South. Even if the Democrat was a Catholic from New York in the middle of all that anti-Catholic bias, even if the Democrat is a Yankee from Illinois and the Republican is the world's greatest war hero. But now, this year, 1964, the Deep South goes Republican. Exactly as Johnson had predicted it would after he signed into law the Civil Rights Act. However, Johnson wasn't completely accurate because he said for a generation, and it's actually been much longer than that.